Hi, I'm Bog. I've mained Retribution Paladin for years, playing at both a cutting-edge raid level, as well as obtaining the 0.1% Mythic Plus title. In this video, I'm going to give you everything that you need to master the Retribution Paladin in Season 3 of War Within. Whether you're pushing keys or raiding, this guide will break down everything from talents, gearing, rotation, utility, as well as some more advanced tips and tricks. I've timestamped everything so you can skip ahead if you are looking for something specific. All right, let's start out with talents. Now, I'm not going to go over every single talent node individually, mainly just the ones that I think are worth noting in how they impact your gameplay. I'll also touch on some flex picks that you might be able to take in different situations. So this season, the same as last season and the season before, both the Mythic Plus and raid builds will be taking the Templar hero talents. So what this does is once you use your Wake of Ashes, it will turn the spell into a 5 holy power Hammer of Light. This drops a large hammer on your primary target. With the tier set, we'll also drop hammers on 3 additional targets around it. And then after using it, you'll get a buff called Empyrean Hammers, which will then periodically drop small hammers from the sky onto all of the enemies around you. Both of the builds are also running the Crusading Strikes talent. This turns our auto attacks into a holy power generator, effectively. And then lastly, both of the talent builds will also run Radiant Glory. So this removes our classic Wings or Crusade cooldown and turns our Wake of Ashes into that cooldown. This pretty much turns Retribution Paladin into a 30-second cooldown spec for all intents and purposes. So we've got the Mythic Plus talents open, so we will start on the Retribution side for those. Despite the nerfs, Divine Hammer, which causes little hammers to spin around us for a period of time, is still worth taking for a single talent point. It's no longer a buff that we need to permanently maintain like last season, but it is still a very strong single point. In Mythic Plus, I generally recommend taking Final Reckoning over Execution Sentence. Final Reckoning is about a 1% AoE gain with approximately a 4% single target loss. You can definitely run Execution Sentence if you're looking for more priority focused damage, but I think in general, Final Reckoning is definitely the play for most situations. The other pick that's worth noting for the Mythic Plus build is Divine Arbiter versus Searing Light. So generally speaking, if you're going for raw output damage, Searing Light is probably going to be better. However, I have found that Divine Arbiter is, I guess, a much more ethical way of building out the Mythic Plus damage profile. So this is much more priority focused damage. It's going to give us a bit of a single target boost versus Searing Light just being mass AoE. I generally recommend playing this over Searing Light. However, you can kind of swing either way. Other notable talents that you could maybe flex into in different situations, Empyrean Legacy is good. It will basically force us to use a Final Verdict in AoE situations every now and then, so that is more priority focused damage. Rush of Light can sometimes be good for the haste benefit, but otherwise this build is pretty stock standard, and the only change that you might want to make if you need, say, more AoE would be something like this. And then if you wanted to go like really heavy priority focus, you would go something like this. So on the class side, we pretty much want to just take talents that directly relate to the utility that we require. We have something like Cleanse Toxins, which is our poison and disease remove. This is really good in places like Arakara. Unbound Freedom, I generally recommend taking in every situation. So this causes our freedom to be used on our targeted player, but then it also will rebound onto us, so we get effectively 2 uses out of it, and gives both a 30% move speed. This is really good not just for the actual utility itself, but like the mobility that it gives us, because Ret, outside of using Divine Steed, is actually pretty slow. If you do, say, drop something like Cleanse Toxins, you can take something like Empyrean Ward. You could take punishment for a little bit of increased damage whenever you interrupt something. But in general, I would sort of just have a look at this tree and see exactly what you might need in a certain dungeon. The rest of the damage nodes are sort of locked in for us. You can also take this talent here, which is to like and subscribe to my channel. This is a guaranteed 10% DPS increase to Retribution Paladins. All right, so over to the raid build now. Not a huge amount changes. We do actually keep a lot of the same talents. Divine Arbiter now becomes just 100% lock-in, and same sort of thing with Execution Sentence, but we then add Executioner's Will to extend its duration. This sort of forms the crux of our single target raid rotation. Same as before with the Paladin side of the tree, we kind of want to take talents based on I guess what we need for each fight. In raid, something like Improved Blessing of Protection can be good if we maybe need a couple of bops throughout the fight. Realistically, in general, though, a lot of Ret's utility doesn't actually get used a lot in raid. So I would just look at things on a fight-by-fight basis. If you see that there's Poison Dispels, you can pick something like this up. You can even drop Rebuke in a lot of raid fights, since we're not going to have to kick a lot of the time. So you could, say, move this into, Improved Blessing of Sacrifice if you think you're going to be trying to help out the healer a little bit. But in general, the Paladin side of the tree, you can pretty much just sort of copy as is. And then, again, same with the Ret side, it doesn't really move much on a fight-to-fight basis. So I'm going to leave the links for the talents in the description below. If you have any questions about specific nodes, also drop them in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them. I know I've sort of glossed over this a little bit, but I think that digging apart the talent tree is generally not that beneficial of a thing for us to be doing. One thing that I think is worth noting is that there are two buffs that are actually important to be keeping up with Ret. The first comes from our Blade of Justice. Expurgation is pretty much just a 10-second burn that goes on the target after we use this ability. And then Greater Judgment, which will apply a damage amp every time we use Judgment. Now, you want to maintain these for as much as 100% uptime as you possibly can. However, I found that in our general rotation, we kind of just keep these up anyway. So I wanted to mention them because they are important to our damage. But if you're moving through a rotation in the way that I've sort of outlined, you shouldn't have to even look at these buffs. They should just be maintained close to 100% of the time, pretty much always. So next up, we'll look at gearing. Gearing for Ret's actually fairly flexible in terms of secondary stats, which is really nice for us. A general rule of thumb is that all secondary stats except for Verse are sort of equal to one another. However, if you want like a specific priority focused, I would say Mastery is technically the best, but Crit and Mastery are pretty much neck and neck, followed by Haste just behind that, and then Verse being the one that we really don't want much of. Realistically, I think a good target is to aim for 20% haste, followed by an even spread of Crit and Mastery. Obviously, simming your character is going to be the most optimal thing to do, but if you aim for these numbers, you're pretty much going to land bang on the mark most of the time. As with pretty much every spec, primary stat is king, so normally a higher item level piece, even if it's got like bad secondary stats, is going to be better for DPS than something with perfect secondary stats. For our trinkets, two of the raid trinkets are going to be our best trinkets this season. We've got Eras's Ritual Forge and the Astral Antenna. This is going to be our absolute best. However, fortunately for us, the next three best trinkets are all dungeon trinkets. We've got Arakara Sackbrood from City of Echoes. We've got the Improvised Seaphorium Pacemaker from Floodgate, which despite some nerfs from last season is still pretty good. And then Signet of the Priory. So if you're not a raider, these are trinkets that you can aim for. And I think if you end up running two dungeon trinkets, it's actually going to be pretty good as well. But our absolute best is these two raid trinkets. So the set bonus for Templar this tier is, I guess, pretty negligible in the sense that it doesn't change our overall gameplay too much. It pretty much just leans into what we already want to be doing. So what the 4 set this season is going to do is give us an additional Hammer of Light directly after we use the first one following Wake of Ashes. So in general, this isn't going to change our gameplay much. It's pretty much just going to give us 2 of our hero talent spenders back to back. Similar to most specs as well, if you have the 4 set from last season, you generally won't want to be putting on the tier set until you get the current season's 4 set as well, because the previous season 4 set is going to outperform a 2 set combination. All right, we'll just quickly touch on enchants and consumables. So I'll just pop a list of the enchants that we'll be using on the screen. This has been pulled from the Wowhead guide, which is a really good resource to refer to if anyone likes written copies of things. The one thing to note is that it's given the ring enchant as a mastery enchant. I think you can use the ring enchant to pretty much pad out your stats that might be falling behind. So if you're a bit low on haste, go for the haste enchant. Same with crit. This is more of a flexible one. The rest of the enchants are pretty much just copy paste from this table. For food, primary stat is going to be our best food, so a feast. If you don't have a feast, you can go for a secondary stat personal food like Baladar's Bounty. Even pushing last season, I was relying on Baladar's Bounty a lot. So the primary and secondary stat foods are pretty close together. So save yourself some coin. Don't drop feasts all the time unless you're absolutely loaded. Our weapon oil is going to be the Algari Mana Oil. Nothing much to say here. Just put it on. And lastly is the flask. Now, technically speaking, the Flask of Alchemical Chaos is going to be our Bis Flask. However, I tend to like to use flasks as a way of padding out secondary stats. So what I mean by that is if you're finding that you're lagging behind with a certain stat, you can flask for that one in particular. So if we look at my current gear, it's a little bit skewed because of the random items that I got last week for the M0 runs. But I currently am very low on crit. So what I would probably be doing is using a Flask of Tempered Aggression, which is a crit flask. Same sort of thing early on in the season. You might have really low haste. The class might feel really sluggish. You might be only 13%. Flask of Tempered Swiftness is going to be good. I think if your stats are kind of balanced the way that you would want them to be, then going for Alchemical Chaos is going to be a good choice. However, using one of the other 3 flasks except for Verse, depending on where your stats land early in the season, is also a really good option as well. All right, so onto the rotation. One of the big upsides to Ret, I think, is its overall simplicity and also lack of punishment on mistakes that are made. Very, very easy spec to get into and do pretty close to maximum possible damage, even with just a little bit of practice. So Ret's a classic builder spender. We use builders like Blade of Justice and Judgment to build our Holy Power, and then Final Verdict is our spender in single target, and Divine Storm is our spender in AoE. So we're going to start with our Mythic Plus. All right, we swapped over to the Mythic Plus build. So what the opener is going to look like if we have Divine Hammers up and off cooldown. We are going to start with Divine Toll. This is going to give us 5 Holy Power in AoE. We will then Divine Hammers, Final Reckoning, Wake of Ashes, Hammer of Light. We then, with our tier set, will want to build to 5 Holy Power again. But without the tier set, we will then just go straight into our regular priority. So in AoE, our priority is going to look something like this. We are going to want to use Blade of Justice as our main builder. We will want to use Judgment as our second in line. And then while we've got Wings up, which we have let them drop off at the moment, but we are going to want to use Hammer of Wrath as a literal I have nothing else to press button. In general, very simple. So we want to build and then spend. In general, you also want to try and spend pretty much as soon as you hit 3 or more holy power. The reason for this is Ret has a lot of, I guess, things that will just incidentally build our holy power. So if we wait too long, we risk sort of overcapping. I'm only half paying attention here, so that's actually happening a lot at the moment. Now, one other thing that I wanted to note with Divine Arbiter as the talent is this buff right here. I'm going to look behind the camera. Once this hits 25, we want to then be using a final verdict even in AoE. So what this is doing is a burst of damage on the main target and a bit of splash damage on the targets around it. Okay, just quickly, now if you don't have Divine Hammers up, we'll pretend that this is off cooldown here. You would want to start with Blade of Justice, Final Reckoning, Wake of Ashes, Big Hammer. You sort of want to spend Divine Toll as close to 0 as possible, but if you have a Holy Power from, say, a Crusading Strike proc, that's fine, and then you just go into your normal rotation from there. Okay, we've swapped to a raid build and gone over to a single target dummy. So the opener and rotation in single target in the raid build and in the Mythic Plus build is actually very similar. We're going to want to open with Divine Toll. Single target, this will only give us 2 holy power. So we're going to then follow it up with a Blade of Justice, Divine Hammer. We then Execution Sentence. We use our trinkets, pots, whatever we need. Wake of Ashes to take us to 5. We then spend our Big Hammer. And then after that, we pretty much just go into our single target priority. Now, single target priority is slightly different to the AoE one. We want to prioritize Judgment as our first builder, followed by Hammer of Wrath if it's available. If not, into Blade of Justice. Now, it's worth noting for Ret that I know we've talked about priority in terms of which builders you want to be using first. The thing with Ret is the difference between, say, building with a Judgment versus a Blade of Justice in AoE is actually, and in single target, is actually very negligible. The thing with Ret is, while it is good to keep in mind that there is like an optimal priority, in general, you just want to be spending your globals. I think a lot of the time people can get a little bit overwhelmed cognitively by, I need to be pressing this specific thing in this specific situation. With Ret, as long as you're pressing your buttons and spending every global that you can, it really doesn't matter. If you're using your Wake of Ashes on cooldown, if you're jamming as many spenders into your execution sentence as possible, your DPS is going to be just fine. It is very much a how fast can you press your buttons type of spec rather than a press everything in the perfect order type of spec. On to defensives and utility. So Ret has always been kind of spoiled for defensives and utility, and this patch is no exception. For what we will call small defensives, we have first up Divine Protection. This gives us just a flat 20% damage reduction. We also have Shield of Vengeance. This gives us a shield based on how max HP that explodes after 10 seconds based on the amount of damage that we've taken. These can be considered like minor defensives, just to say ward off a little bit of rot damage, but they won't protect us from huge hits or anything. For large defensives, we have Divine Shield, or Bubble, as it's more colloquially known. This is a full immune from damage and basically almost all debuffs for 8 seconds. It'll also cleanse most debuffs if they're already on you as well. Second, we've got Lay on Hands. This is a full HP bar heal that you can use on either yourself or an ally. Third, we've got Blessing of Protection. This can be used again on either yourself or an ally and will fully immune all physical damage, as well as remove bleed effects. Be careful, if you use this on the tank, it also drops aggro completely, so probably don't use it on the tank unless they know it's coming. And then I guess lastly, we can also spend our holy power on Word of Glory instead of our damaging spenders, so this is just a heal that we can use on either ourselves or an ally. So for utility, we also have a lot. First up, we have Hammer of Justice. This is a very short CD single target stun, great for interrupting abilities in Mythic Plus or, say, delaying trash from doing something. We have Blessing of Freedom, which, if we take the Unbound Freedom talent that we talked about earlier, will remove a movement impair from both the person that we target as well as ourselves at the same time, and also add a speed boost to us. We have Blinding Light. This is just an AOE stop. It's not that impactful, but definitely will get used. We have a Battle Res, which costs no resources. We also have Cleanse Toxins, as mentioned before, to remove poison and diseases. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, is Blessing of Sacrifice. So Sac will transfer 30% of the damage taken from an enemy to yourself. We can use this to look after a squishy target that is getting hit pretty hard. You can also use it on the tank if you haven't got like a pain suppression or something like that. However, you do need to be mindful that because you're taking 30% of the damage, if the person is taking a lot of damage, you need to also pair it with a personal defensive, because this can get you killed if you're not careful. Now, what separates a good Ret from a great Ret is normally use of utility. Because Ret's rotation is very, very straightforward, you will very quickly get to the point where you're doing quite good damage on it. However, we have a lot of different utility spells that can be very helpful in different situations. What I normally recommend doing is setting up all of these abilities using a mouse over macro, and then learning what abilities in each dungeon interact with these. For example, you've got lots of poisons going out in Arakara, so chucking out Cleanse Toxins on your party members is going to be a huge help to your healer. Freedom has some very weird interactions with abilities. You've got the first mini-boss of Priory, Suleiman, who does the Thunderclap stomp thing. Freedom actually fully immunes that, so you can pretty much guard yourself and an ally from every second stop. Again, there's so many different interactions. I will probably make a video down the track of where Ret utility actually interacts with different elements of each dungeon. But in general, be mindful of what's going on with your party and what you can do with these utility spells, Lay on Hands, Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Sacrifice, to keep them from dying from abilities that your healer or themselves may not be able to save them from. Okay, so for weak auras and add-ons, I generally just recommend using a weak aura pack that displays all the information that you need close at hand. This is the Afinar pack. I will leave a link in the description to this for anyone who's interested in using it. One big benefit to this pack is it displays a melee swing timer. So this gets a little bit into like the more advanced sort of tips and tricks. You might have remembered me saying before that Ret has a lot of passive holy power generation. What this means is that we can overcap on holy power very easily, and it is just expected that it will happen. However, using a swing timer, if we start swinging at this target here, we can see that this is going up. Now, what this means is every time it hits max, we're going to generate a holy power. So you can see that this has gone up. This will impact our rotation in, say, a couple of different situations. You might be looking to spend a, say, Blade of Justice at 2 holy power, but then you might notice that, oh, your swing time is about to hit max, which is then going to take you to 3. So on top of that Blade of Justice, you would then hit 5. Now, if you've also got something like Divine Resonance going, this is after you use Divine Toll. Every 5 seconds, you're pretty much going to generate holy power again. These are things that are worth tracking to make sure that we're not overcapping unnecessarily. So I highly recommend that you get a weak aura with these 2 buffs and the swing timer included on it. However, if you're just beginning, I wouldn't pay too much attention to it to start with. This is something that you can do once you get very comfortable with the build spend cadence of the spec. This is just the way that we can squeeze out that little bit extra damage by, I guess, saving ourselves a few holy power here and there when we might otherwise overcap by accident. I hope you found this video guide useful. I tried to condense the guide down as much as I can while still incorporating the core information that we needed to know. If you have any more specific questions, let me know in the comments down below. I may also follow this up with a more advanced Ret guide, although as I said, Ret's very simple, so there's not too many advanced tips and tricks that I could cover. Drop a like and subscribe, all that YouTuber shenanigans if you enjoyed. Plenty more Mythic Plus content, Ret content to come down the track. Otherwise, until next time, gamers, take care.